Welcome back to another episode of That's Business. Today's guest is an independent journalist and communicator with more than 15 years of experience covering real estate, mortgages, and personal finance. Debbie has appeared in Wall Street Journal, CNN, Forbes, Fortune, Newsweek, the Associated Press, and other outlets. Debbie previously led content and communications at a national mortgage lender and has held editorial leadership and writing roles at large fintech companies and a global real estate brokerage. Debbie, I'm really excited to dive into all the greatness that is you, and just your features alone is mad impressive. But first, before we dive into you, growing up, did you know you always wanted to be a writer and be this creative, or what did you, air quote, want to be when you grew up?
Funnily enough, I think in kindergarten, I wanted to be a veterinarian. So journalism was absolutely not on my radar, probably until high school. And it was funny because I went through a period where, I thought maybe I could do classical singing, opera. And, I minored in that at the beginning. And then I quickly decided, maybe this isn't practical enough. So I'll go into journalism. But as we know, anybody who's been in journalism a number of years, the media industry has gone under so much change in the last 20 years. So not as practical as maybe I thought initially, but that's where I ended up.
Okay, wait, classical, musical, and opera, you said? So you've been an opera singer? I
do. I'm like classical training, but I love opera. It's something I've always enjoyed listening to, attending, and I had a flirtation with the idea that maybe I could make it on the big grand stage, singing opera. But I knew that was a harder path to go down just because it's so competitive in the opera world. But it's something I briefly flirted with, thought it would be cool, and quickly reality set in, and you were like, okay, well, probably need to be a little more practical in my career choices.
That's fair. And to have that so early on, I mean, that's huge because a lot of people, I feel, go 20, 30 years and they're like, oh, just kidding. I've hated everything I've done and I need to start over. So how did we learn on journalism being that kind of practical thing to do instead?
Well, I've always loved writing and always had a knack for asking questions and being very curious. And so I think as I examined what to do after high school, it just seemed like a natural fit. I'd always grown up hearing about Woodward and Bernstein and Buchanan and some of these journalism greats and thought, I want to that's going to be me one day. But, it's funny because when you go through J school and you think about what your path's going to look like afterwards, I actually got my start in a newspaper writing obituaries.
Someone's got to do it.
We start at the bottom, but that's actually one of the best training I think I had because it really taught you how to write concisely, and you're summing up in a person's entire life in a matter of a few sentences, right? So you really had to be strategic about how you wrote those obits. And, I swear, your first editor is always your toughest one. And I feel like that really gave me a thick skin to do this long term, because you can't be in journalism and not have a thick skin and be open to constructive criticism.
In some of those experiences, I feel the exact same way of whether it's a first boss or first person it's like you're so young and just like, I don't know, is this how it is? And this how life is? But I think
exactly.
You're thankful for it later on when, things kind of roll off the tongue or it's easy, no problem now
right.
As we advance in our career. So what makes a good and not so good obituary? Because I've read plenty and you could tell when someone professional has written it and someone has not. So what makes for a good one and a not so good one?
Gosh, I know some people like to settle scores in their obits. It's actually scary. Some of the requests we would get from families, and I'm thinking to myself, you really want to say that about this person as their final send-off? But I think you really just want to capture the essence of their life, right? So back then, the obits that we did for most people, folks who were public figures and whatnot, were very short and sweet. They were generally a free service we provided. So they had to be only a few sentences long. So you had to just give the bare bones of, unless you were paying to have a placement, and you can make it longer. And I think it's just a matter of capturing the essence of who they were, maybe without going into the skeletons in the closet, right? Because some people, let it all out in the obits. I've seen some interesting ones in my time, but Luckily for me, that was it was an entry point to my real newspaper. Well, to the long-term newspaper job, which was a cops and porch reporter. So, I got to graduate from writing the obits and did cops and porch reporting, which was very exciting, but also very stressful. And that definitely teaches you how to handle high pressure situations. You're dealing with victims' families of crimes. You're dealing with criminals. I remember going down to the prison and interviewing people on death row. You're
Wow.
dealing with law enforcement officials. So it definitely teaches you grace under pressure and to keep your cool, because the minute you lose it, you lose the plot, you lose the story. It's hard to, regain all of that momentum, and it can really sidetrack you if you're somebody that gets frenzied, or out of sorts very easily. So it definitely taught me a lot. I'm glad that was my first job, but I'm glad I got beyond that eventually, because it was a stressful, that's not something you want to do if you have a family and you actually like to sleep and you enjoy having a life.
Yes. So that's completely different kind of styles of writing and everything like that. So
Sure.
what kind of made you decide that was the next step for you? And then how did we kind of end up with where we're at today with finance? I feel like you're like beautiful onion peeling back layers of all the greatness of writing you've done that is so unique that you don't hear about often.
Yeah, it's very different. I didn't get into journalism thinking I'd be a business journalist or write about personal finance. That definitely wasn't on my radar, but I kind of came into it because when, I'm from Florida originally. When we moved out here to Colorado for my husband's postdoc, there weren't a lot of newspaper jobs. So I had to really think about maybe these skills are transferable somewhere else, in a different type of function, but still using storytelling, communications, interviewing skills, all that. So I started working at Remax, which is headquartered here in Denver, as an editor in corporate communications. So really more of a B2B, to their agents around the world, as opposed to writing for consumers. Eventually, we did a little bit of that, but so that was a huge, huge shift for me, going from being a hard news journalist into more of a content marketing, corporate communications type role. But in a way, I'm very grateful for that path, because that's what I've been in that sphere for now 15 plus years, especially in the real estate housing space, covering that industry, which is incredibly critical, to our economy, to people's personal finances, to building generational wealth. When you think about folks who own homes and are able to help their kids get homes and pass those properties down, and it really is a generational wealth builder. So, it's been such a interesting journey, working at a global real estate brand, kind of going back more to the service journalism of fintechs like NerdWallet, Bankrate, and then leading communications and content for a national mortgage lender. So, life takes you in some very unexpected places, but I'm glad for the journey, because I feel like sometimes even, when you experience a layoff, and I've gone through a few of them in my career, you really have to look at it as, it's redirection, not necessarily rejection. It's hard to see it at the time, but I think with some age and some wisdom, I've now been able to look at it that way. But when you're in it, it's a little harder to see it that way. But that's kind of led me to where I am today, which is just running my own business as an editor, writer. And, I'm not limited just to real estate and mortgages, but a lot of my clients are in that space. So that subject matter expertise certainly helps to serve those clients. But I love it. I love the freedom and the flexibility, and being able to work with people who align with my values, who value the content that's accurate and that's high quality, well researched. And, I think media literacy is such an important thing, and financial literacy, and they kind of go hand in hand. And I'm just grateful I keep getting to do that every day.
I feel like so many people have either been fired, laid off, and it's honestly like you mourn that loss of a job. And, being on the other side of it, it's easier to say, oh, yeah, it's great. But, or, at the time being, it's devastating, as you mentioned. So where did the idea to start your own business kind of come in your head of like, maybe I should do my own thing? I'm just so fascinated with what you do now, but where did this idea kind of come from? And when did you decide to take the leap and go all in on it?
Yeah. So, I had freelance in between roles before. anyone who's a journalist, I mean, it's something that you easily can fall back on. I say easily, it's not always so easy because right now, for example, the freelance marketplace is flooded. I mean, there's tons of people who are going freelance just because this whole idea of corporate job stability is no longer a thing. I feel that, when I was coming up and looking at the job market, that's where you thought you needed to be. You needed to climb the corporate ladder, and that was your path. But I think we know, judging by all of the layoffs we've seen the last few years since COVID, that there's no such thing as corporate job stability, right? So for me, it was realizing, okay, this is something I know I can do, but I haven't actually invested full time in it, and really decided, hey, I'm going to just do this instead of it being my fallback in between, full-time roles. So for me, that really just involved setting up an LLC, getting a website, going to get professional photos, which for me is a cringy thing. I'm not.
Oh, same.
Yeah, I'm not somebody who loves being in front of a camera or marketing myself. Those are things that don't come naturally to me being a journalist. I like to be the one behind the scenes asking the questions. And so to kind of put yourself out there in front of a camera or as the subject matter expert, right? It's not something that comes as naturally. So I really, I think it was 2023 when I started going down this path. And that was after I had been laid off from the mortgage company. Unfortunately, mortgages and the housing industry as a whole has struggled the last few years since mortgage rates have stayed elevated and home sales have jumped to 30-year lows. So it wasn't a surprise when it happened, but it was still tough because I had just been promoted a few months prior. So it was a bummer, but I also was like, well, listen, maybe take the time here to invest in yourself and to believe in yourself enough to go after something that your success is only limited by you and how much effort and work you put into it. It's not, you're not a number on somebody else's balance sheet, right? And so that's really what gave me the motivation, kind of lit the fire under me to let's make this happen. Let's make this work, because there is no guarantee in a corporate job that you're going to be there, when they need to start trimming back on costs. So, and it's been going great. I started in 2023, and then in 2024, I really went all in, was able to expand my client base, had a lot of moments where I had to decide, listen, you're not going to take every single job that comes your way, not every single client, because I think there's a general undervaluing of the work writers do and editors, and the instinct I think a lot of companies are is, especially with AI, we can just pay pennies. And so, I really stuck to my guns and only worked with clients who are willing to pay what I felt I was worth. So that really had, I think, a big impact on my ability to scale and do what I wanted to do and meet the goals I had set for myself, both income-wise, client-wise, and just the freedom and flexibility of being able to call my own shots and spending more quality time, for example, with my family and being more present. Like, that's, to me, the biggest benefit of being able to own my own business. I mean, I still have to put the work in, but I'm able to do it around my family schedule as opposed to on somebody else's edict, right? So I think, to me, that's the most important part of it.
And I love that you had that realization, because I feel like a lot of business owners, it takes them a few years to realize they shouldn't accept everyone as clients, or how do you price things? And it's hard. It's hard to price your services too. Mm-hmm. So I love what you write about, because it's not the sexiest topic, but everyone needs to know. And people oftentimes are embarrassed or just kind of like, my personal finances or the housing market, I don't want to feel stupid. So how do you approach the content you do and kind of make it fun in a sense and informational instead?
The key word I'd use here is accessibility, right? I think people feel that financial literacy is kind of a gate. There's gatekeeping going on, or there's a lot of advice that's dispensed by big gurus out there who will not be named, but it's wrapped up in a lot of shame, right? And it's, you spent money on this latte or avocado toast. Right? That's the cliche I've heard for years. That's why millennials can't afford homes. Millennials can't afford homes because cost of homes and mortgage rates have far outpaced wage growth, right? So let's be real. Yes, do you need to be mindful of your spending? Absolutely. But those little pleasures here and there are not going to add up to the big enough savings that you need to be able to buy the average home in America right now. So I think people get caught up in that minutia. So to me, it's about making the information shame-free, accessible, and, to frame it in a way that really makes people understand that when you understand how money works, you have choices. And I think this is especially important for women, right, in financial literacy. When I was coming up, I didn't understand investing. I didn't know anything about taxes. That was not something that was spoken about in my home, really. I certainly learned how to balance a checkbook and the basics, but I had to learn on my own, the credit card game and personal loans and things like that. So I feel that the earlier women, especially young women, understand the importance and the value of compound interest and high yield savings accounts and investing and, saving for retirement. Those are things that can help you really change the trajectory of your life, right? You will have choices to leave bad relationships. You will have choices to move jobs if there's a job that's not a right fit for you, or you're burnt out, or it's awful, right? And I think that if we focused on having people understand the value and importance of financial literacy from a very young age, that would change so many people's lives and the trajectory of their futures, right? So that to me is when I'm writing a piece of content about something that is complex, and often it is, right? When we're getting really technical about mortgage terms or loan products, or talking about getting out of debt and all of these topics that really have a long-term impact on your credit profile and what you're able to do in your life, right? Financially, it's just making it accessible and understandable, right? Leaving the jargon out of it, leaving the highbrow out of it, and just making it accessible to everyday folks. And so I think that's how I try to approach that content, as just writing it in plain English and, leaving the jargon out of it. I always love to interview subject matter experts, because they're the ones kind of on the front lines, and they're the ones that are lending the money and dealing with borrowers. So it's always in the lens of how does this benefit the reader, and what are the key takeaways? What are the action items a reader is going to get from this, and how can they improve their lives? And I think for me, I wish I had some of those resources when I was coming up, because it would have made life a little easier, right? But you learn as you go, and there's part of that. But I think the great thing about today and generations that are up and coming is that they have access to so much information that, and different fun ways to learn it, right? I would never think TikTok would be a way to educate people about money, but here we are. And I mean, there are people that are very successful doing it. But I think you also have to be careful, because not all advice is good advice. So you definitely have to, I think, qualify the advice you're getting and make sure that it's sound. So there's that too.
Yes. And how would you recommend qualifying that advice for someone that maybe doesn't have the journalism training that you do, that you're the subject matter expert, outside of course, reading the things you have your hands on and you do your fact checking and everything on that, and this, but how can a viewer or digester of this content, what are some red flags you typically see? Or like you said, the shaming of the $5 drink or something that you said is not going to, change your life to buy a house. But what are some of those other red flags you typically see?
Yeah, I think anything that's absolutes, right? There's a middle ground, I think, in personal finance. It's not always the extremes. And it also depends on your goals, right? If your goal is to eventually buy a home, there's a lot of myths out there. People still think you have to put 20% down. I mean, that hasn't been the case in a long time. I mean, you can get into a home with 0% down if you have a BA loan, or as little as 3% with some conventional programs. So it's really taking a time to vet your sources and make sure that you're, looking at the source of the information. So look at official bank websites, look at trusted government websites, right? CFPB is Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, excellent resource. They have a lot of consumer-facing content about all things lending, mortgages, credit, debt. So that's one place I'd go. And, there's also great low cost or even free counseling services for consumers, whether it's credit, housing. I mean, there's so many resources out there that are free or reduced cost. So that's the other thing I always point people to if they really are trying to decipher and get to the bottom of various advice they're hearing is the right source, right? Go to a certified counselor, somebody who's with the NFCC, for example, or a legit consumer credit counseling service. So I think that's really important that you double check your sources. Don't take everything on TikTok and YouTube as Bible, because sometimes there are bad players there that are not giving good advice, or they're trying to sell you something. Of course, that's what I've been seeing a lot of. There's a lot of these get rich quick schemes, and they're promising you the world and instant wealth if you buy their course and invest thousands of dollars first. So just be careful. And if something seems too good to be true, it probably is. So, and then the other step is there are financial advisors, right? If you get to a point in your career where you're earning, good income and you're wanting some guidance on how to achieve certain financial goals, a financial advisor, is a good investment, perhaps.
Bringing up the free coaching, because that was something that was really eye-opening to me when I was going through the process of buying my house, was my broker was just willing to straight up help me and give me resources, or she was partnered with someone to help with debt, or I had a credit issue from a discrepancy on account from 7 years ago that was still showing. So that's a great point to bring up, because I was so blindsided of like, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to pay all this money to do this and that. And it's
right.
But so many options. So there's so many options out there for free programming. And I love bringing up, yes, you have to buy my course. And the guarantees is a big one. I feel like in any industry, I guarantee you a job. I guarantee this. It's like, well, everyone has so many different factors into their situation. How are you about to guarantee that? So
exactly. So they make it sound enticing, but you really have to, put that journalist cap on and be skeptical, right? And I hate to say it that way, but it's true. Like you do have to, and ask a lot of questions, exhaust them with the questions, because that's how you get to the truth, right? And so the other thing is, what I tell people is a good first step is just seeing where you stand. So look at annualcreditreport.com. It's a free way to access your credit report once a year, and all Americans have access to that. So check to see if there's accounts you forgot about, or something that went to collections, or if there's an error. Sometimes there's just legit errors and you need to contact that debtor, or the creditor rather, and you need to, go to them and say, hey, this is not right. Can you please correct it and fix that error with the credit bureau? So that's always a good first step. Anytime you're going to take out a car loan or a, shop for a mortgage, is to see where you stand on your credit first.
Now, if someone's kind of new in their journey, is there a certain age? Because I feel like a lot of people always feel, oh, I'm too young, I don't know, or I'm too old, I can't get started on this. But is there a certain age, or when should people kind of decide? Or is it just, hey, jump in and figure out your finances? But what are kind of some of the myths in the industry you see centered around personal finance, centered around buying a house or getting your finances in order, that you typically see that you want to dispel on this podcast?
Yeah, I don't know if there's an age per se. It's, as soon as you're working and earning an income, right, over a certain amount, you pay taxes on that, right? So I think that's the biggest thing is, especially high school students, understanding if you have a part-time job and you earn over a certain amount, you might have to pay taxes on that. So keeping really good records, making sure that you're just reading a lot, what I am doing so I have a 15-year-old daughter, and, I plan to add her eventually as an authorized user on my credit card as a way to build her credit before, we go off and just give her a piece of plastic and say, hey, have fun with that. Absolutely not. You want to make sure you're doing it in a controlled setting that's safe, right? That there's limits on it and there's oversight so that they learn how to use it responsibly. And so, my advice to other parents, for example, who might have kids who are coming up in their teen years or, going to college, is start there, right? Don't just give them an open-ended credit card with a $10,000 limit, because you're going to be crying tears, when they overspend, right?
Maxed out, right?
Right. So, always start small and have those conversations early on. Gosh, around the family table about finances. When I was growing up, money was kind of taboo as a topic. It wasn't really openly discussed. So I think that's the first step, is just making it less of a stigma or a taboo to discuss money. And that doesn't mean you have to say, oh yeah, we're making this much and this is how much is coming in and going out. But I think the more you give your kids, a sense of how you manage money and how having a healthy approach to discussing money, it will be so scary to them, right? And it certainly, will make sure that when they get into a relationship that they approach it with an open, and it will actually be odd to them that somebody is reluctant to talk about money, right? Because that's a red flag. If somebody's unwilling to talk about finances and you're going to combine lives and combine finance, like money, you need to be able to have a very frank conversation. So that would be one thing. The other is it concerns home ownership is, I've known people that have bought their first house really young, like 20, 21, 22, which in a lot of places is not attainable just because cost of living. But a common thing I see is folks who will buy something and rent out. Either they use a low down payment program, and then you can get down payment assistance on top of that. Now, some of these do have income requirements. Sometimes there's limits in terms of how much money you can borrow. But generally speaking, what they do is, once they get the property, they then rent out a room or two, right? And so it's called house hacking. You can either do it with the property you're in as a single family property, or you can buy, let's say, up to 4 units, live in one unit and rent out the other 3 or, 2, whatever it is. And that can help go pay your mortgage. So, that's something that I think is harder to do in some housing markets because you don't see a lot of multi-unit properties maybe. Where I live, they're not as common as maybe they were in Florida. But, if you are able to qualify for and get a house and you rent out a room or 2 or a basement, what have you, you're building wealth by owning your own home, but you're also making sure that you have passive income in a way to help pay those bills on the property without it all resting on your shoulders. And then that way, what that does is sets you up for success, that you have a couple of years, you pay, start paying that down, building equity, and then you can turn around and go, either you do it again with another property and rent out the former property. And I see people, that's how they get into real estate investing. But if you're just looking strictly for a place to live, you really can, I think, get ahead if you do the house hacking and you have roommates, especially when you're young. That's the time to do it, right? When you don't have a partner or kids, then you can, as long as you don't mind, sharing common spaces and, being you're a landlord essentially. So, but yeah, I think it happens on your timeline, right? I don't think there's an ideal age. The average age of first-time home buyers has steadily gone up. I think it's now closer to late 30s, mid to late 30s now than it, used to be. But that's just because home prices is just so much more expensive to buy a property today than it ever has been in comparison to wages. So I think in some places like New York City, most people don't own their own home, right? They're forever renters, and they're okay with that because they live in a market where the cost of living is just so high that it doesn't make financial sense maybe to purchase the home. And they want to have that freedom and flexibility to, move around different places. So it really is location specific, goal specific, and, what your financial and credit situation looks like. One thing I always tell people is when you do own your own home, just be prepared to have a backup reserves because something always breaks, something always needs to be replaced or repaired. We're right now looking at having to re-insulate our attic because it's, the temperature fluctuations in our home is crazy. So, that's a couple thousand right there. We've had to replace our furnace or HVAC. Like these things all add up. So that's why I always say, if you can own a home and you want to, it is a great investment, but it's not for everyone. And that's okay too, because yes, you're going to spend a lot of money over a time fixing things and replacing things. Now you're building your own wealth and you're building that equity rather than paying it for your landlord when you're renting. But still, not everybody wants that responsibility. They just want to call their landlord like, hey, you fix this now.
I've done both. I see both. I see perks to both. So I get it.
Exactly. I love our home. This is probably our home for a very long time. We refinanced when the rates hit lows during COVID. So that 2.25, 15-year loan that we've got, we're probably going to die here. So we're okay with that. That's fine.
It's okay. Oh, amazing. Wow. You gave so much good advice in that last bit. But as we wrap this up, any other advice you have for listeners outside of I've learned so much from this podcast from you, but any other piece of advice?
Yeah, I think the biggest takeaway I've had just in the especially last 2 years, if we think about COVID and the ups and downs of the economy and, how people are feeling right now just about, where the world is at and maybe where their own financial situations and careers are, is just this concept of resiliency and the idea that if one door shuts, another opens. And I think it's so important that we focus on what we can control, both personally and professionally. And sometimes, when you're in that storm, it's hard to think that way, right? You're bogged down in you go into a negative thought spiral. Like, hey, I've been there, in my layoffs, those were pretty traumatic, because it just shakes your world up and you're not expecting it. But, what I think is really important is you look to the future and you look at it as a redirection, and it can really cause you to think about what you want for your life and what do you want your life to look like, and then figuring out the way to make it happen and to put that into motion and having a support. I'm really lucky that I have a great support system of my husband, my kids, and of course friends and colleagues that I worked with that have been just there for me. And that's the other thing, is just surround yourself with good people that you admire and have this version of success that maybe you hope for yourself. And I think that mindset shift of surrounding yourself with the right people is just really important for anybody, whether you're young, old. What's the saying? Your network is your net worth, or something like that.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
I know it sounds a little cliched, but it's true. It's
so true.
And if you're around negative people and you're only getting negative messaging, that will impact you too. So it's really important to shut the news off, and focus on what you can control right now, and really just zero in on what you want and go after it.
Oh, so true. Debbie, you are amazing. I thank you so much for being on this podcast. For those of you listening to this, you want to check out Debbie's work, you want to work with her, head to the show notes and tune in again next week for another episode of That's Business.
If you're looking for a career change and you're not sure where to start, the Resume Rescue can help. Sure, there's no such thing as the perfect fit for everyone, but here at the Resume Rescue, we're on a mission to find the perfect solution for you. Whether it's changing careers, updating a resume, learning LinkedIn, or practicing interviewing, we have you covered. Find us online at theresumerescue.com and find all of our contact info in our show notes.